Welcome back, everybody. The beauty of doing things online and in person, but we're there. It's all good. We have the best team in-house, so it's all good. Jayne, thank you so much for joining us from Montreal. I'm going to pass it on to you. We're ready to roll. Jayne, Engle.
Okay, good morning, everyone. It's actually my colleague, Tanya Chung-Tiam-Fook, who's going to kick us off, and I will go after her. So please, over to you, Tanya.
Thank you so much, Jayne. Good morning, everyone. Miari, Ani Bujo, Gwe, Tanze, Shego, Ulakut, greetings. My name is Tanya Chung-Tiam-Fook, and I use she, her pronouns. As the co-moderator for this session with the amazing Jayne Engle, I wish to welcome you to this panel session on Reinventing Cities as part of the Art of City Building Conference. My ancestors are from the four directions of creation, Akawayu from the Upper Masaruni in Guyana and Roraima, Brazil, Dutch Romani from the Netherlands, and Fuchun, China. I feel humbled and privileged to be a visitor and conscious steward in what is now called Newmarket, part of the Greater Toronto Area, and the sacred homelands of the Mississauga, of the Credit First Nation, and the traditional territories of the Wendat, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee Confederacies, subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Covenant. I also recognize my role as witness to the settler colonial impacts and transformations that have and continue to impact the lands, peoples, and nation rebuilding of current First Nations of the region. I wish to acknowledge the ancestral and present day caretakers and stewards of Indigenous territories, both urban and rural, throughout Turtle Island, and recognize their continuing connection to the lands, waters, kin, and culture. We pay our respects to their elders past, present, and future, and we aspire to be more attentive and engaged ancestors for the next 7 generations. My current role is as Director of Research and Academic Programs for the Center for Indigenous Innovation and Technology. Other roles include part-time lecturer in environmental studies at York University, associate in Indigenous placekeeping and civic Indigenous partnerships for Evergreen Canada and Future Cities Canada, publication projects, including as co-editor and writer of a book on sacred civics with my esteemed colleague Jayne, and eco-psychology and mental wellness education. So I'm going to just share an Indigenous reimagining of cities from my perspective. As we work collectively toward recovery, repair, resilience, and vitality in our communities and cities in the midst of many interlocking health, climate, socio-political, environmental, and economic crises, we are compelled to rebuild and transform what is broken in our systems and institutions. We can think of this as an opportunity to be more truthful about the world we're leaving behind and more conscious, innovative, and 7 generations minding in our reimagining of a future for current and subsequent generations. We can be bold and brave, reinventing our cities and their integral components aligned with and informed by the diverse realities and aspirations of citizens, and in ways that co-create new pathways and new futures that are equitable, socially connected, in relationship with Mother Earth, healthy and reflective of the expansiveness of human capability and imagination. Let us imagine for a moment a network of human settlements that are each a thriving hub of life, sacred energy, interconnectivity, cooperation, innovation, and creative and reproductive activities aligned with the systems and rhythms of the earth. These urban hubs would be based on regenerative reconciliation economies, inclusive tech and social innovation, human and ecological well-being, sustainable economic development and wealth sharing, revalued public spaces, and adaptive learning and self-renewal in their capital and ecological flows, resources, and networks. Neighborhoods and communities interlinked locally and regionally and globally through a complex web of social and ecological connective tissue that sustain diverse peoples, ecosystems, social systems, and future generations. communities that are rooted in abundance, gifting, reciprocity, commoning, and providing for the future. This is how many indigenous and ancient land-based societies existed prior to colonial contact. And it's a model that continues to inspire and be at the foundation of many contemporary indigenous and non-indigenous communities around the world. How can we work together to build a permanent relationship between the built and social infrastructures of cities and the ecosystems that give them life? As indigenous urbanism and models for planning, placekeeping, urban land stewardship, and governance emerge more within mainstream spaces, there is a growing shift or transition in city building consciousness, values, and models toward a number of different elements that I think are really important. Honoring and integrating indigenous sovereignty, treaties or land agreements, and inherent rights in all civic indigenous relationships, planning, and decision-making. Restoring land rights and access to indigenous nations and peoples, including urban contexts. Honoring the self-sovereignty and inherent rights of urban and rural natural landscapes and species, and recovering their health and well-being. And finally, reconstituting indigenous settler relationships and building a regenerative economy based on how we can more equitably share and co-steward the abundant gifts of Mother Earth and generated wealth across indigenous and settler societies. Such transitions will hopefully shake governments and institutions out of their status quo complacency and power structures, while also laying the foundation for indigenous-informed futures for cities. In her talk on indigenizing cities, Mohawk visionary and lawyer Roberta Jameson calls on indigenous and non-indigenous peoples to create wampum cities, whereby urban areas become places for all peoples to coexist and flourish together in shared space according to their own worldviews, practices, and aspirations. Being conscious and responsible city builders, placekeepers, and caretakers of the land is good medicine for urban communities, ecologies, and public spaces. And it lays both a spiritual and action-oriented foundation for 7 generations. So each of our speakers are incredibly bold thinkers, doers, and city or civic leaders who are pushing the boundaries and transcending the limits of what is possible by reinventing cities through inclusive forms of innovation and concrete, sustainable solution pathways that contribute toward bold systemic shifts and meet the diverse aspirations and futures of the multiplicity of peoples, communities, and ecologies that breathe life into cities. And with that, I will hand over to Jayne. Thank you.
Hey, thank you so much for that, Tanya. Such important and meaningful messages and a beautiful way to open this session. So hello, everyone. Welcome to those who are live at the wonderful library in Chibukdok, Halifax, and also to those joining us online. We are thrilled to have you join us for this Reinventing Cities session. So greetings to everyone from where I am. It's a beautiful island called Tiohtià:ke in Mohawk language, and it's also known as Montreal. These are unceded homelands here of the Mohawk people, and they've been caretakers of these lands and waters here for thousands of years. And I'm grateful to be here as a conscious steward in this wonderful place. And I welcome all of you from the communities where you are. So I want to give a note about these magical, inventive video backgrounds that Tanya and I chose for today. So in the spirit of Reinventing Cities, these are paintings by Christy Belcourt, who is an Indigenous artist of Métis ancestry. And behind Tanya is actually a work that she co-produced with Isaac Murdoch. It's called Uprising, the Power of Mother Earth. And behind me is a painting titled Offerings to Save the World. So we thought these are apropos of our session today. A word about me. I work at the McConnell Foundation. For a number of years, I've had the wonderful privilege to lead our cities work. So from a platform of Cities for People, we've built a number of other collaborative initiatives with many of you, and those include Civic Indigenous 7.0, Reg X, which is about regulatory experimentation and legitimate cities. Future Cities Canada is something that we seeded, a number of other things. And we're also very proud and fortunate to support some incredible work of a number of partners here today, including Canadian Urban Institute. And of course, there in Chipuktuk, Halifax, we have wonderful partners, the Mi'kmaq Native Friendship Center, Inspiring Communities, Develop Nova Scotia, and so many others that we just love to partner with. So I am also an adjunct professor at McGill University School of Urban Planning, and a current project that I am so enthusiastic about is a collaboration with Tanya that she mentioned. It's also with Julian Adjiman and about 25 other people, and it's called Sacred Civics. So it's a collaborative book exploring what it would mean to build 7th-generation cities, which Tanya spoke to some of the themes of that. It's a topic which is highly relevant to reinventing cities. It's really about raising the bar of our responsibilities to each other, to our communities in radically inclusive ways, and also to future generations and to Mother Earth. So by valuing differently what matters for our shared futures, by seeing the city as a commons, for the good of everyone, and by understanding and harnessing the collective wisdom and agency that we can build. So to get right into reinventing cities, what we know is that humanity is capable of so much better than we're doing, right? So the why is so clear for city reinvention. We have growing inequality, we have ecological crises, enduring legacies of racism, genocide, enslavement, and colonialism. Our underlying systems are actually built on these old logics that are not what we need for this age of great transitions that we're moving into. So the why is clear, that cities have to be reinvented, but what about the what and the how? Well, we are very fortunate to have 5 incredibly visionary practitioners with us to share insights about the what and the how of reinventing cities. We have with us Nigel Jacob, Gabriella Gomez-Mont, Matthew Claudel, Aimee Gasparetto, and Pam Glode Desrochers. I'm really pleased that we have a nice long session this morning. So each speaker will speak in turn for about 10 to 15 minutes. And please do pose your questions to them in the chat, or if you're live, hopefully someone has already given you instructions for how to pose questions if you're live. And then we moderators will be seeing those, and we will take questions from the audience at the end. We'll also have time for discussion among the speakers. I think they will have questions for each other as well in their provocative talks. So let's get started. The first speaker is Nigel Jacob, who is at the Boston office for New Urban Mechanics. Welcome, Nigel. So wonderful to see you again. Over to you. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Jayne. And thank you all for being here and for inviting me. My name is Nigel Jacob. I run an organization called the Mayor's Office of New Urban Mechanics. I'm joining you today from the traditional and unceded land of the Massachusetts people. I use the he, his series of pronouns, if you're curious. And I am about to try to share my screen, I think. That's what we're doing, I hope. Can you see that? Thumbs up? Good. Okay, so again, I'm gonna tell you a little bit, 10 minutes, right? So I will do my best, my level best, hit that. I'm gonna tell you a little bit about what New Urban Mechanics is and our approach to urban innovation, city innovation. Obviously, we'll be doing questions at the end. So I look forward to checking back with you at the end of this. New Urban Mechanics was started in 2010, so I've been at this for a while. And the idea all along was to deal with the fact that cities and city government are increasingly being asked to take on the big challenges that the world is facing, climate change and crumbling infrastructure and so on and so on. But the issue is, are we up to the task? Is local government up to the task? And so when my mayor asked me what I thought about this, I thought that we need to rethink the role of local government, that we can no longer just be policymakers or sort of controllers of resources. We need to actually engage with people. So that was really the beginning of New Urban Mechanics. And so over the years, we've done lots of different things. But when I think about what we are fundamentally, there's sort of three clusters of things. I think that, so there's 8 of us on the team. And I think to begin with, we are certainly a community of practice, but we're predicated on the notion of design justice, which means that when we think about what local government does, local government has always been in the design business. We've just done it really badly. We've never conceived of it that way. But whether we're designing policy or regulatory rules or programs or what have you, or buildings for that matter, this question of who gets to design and what are we designing for has always been at the forefront for New Urban Mechanics. So centering on design justice. Number 2, we are certainly a community of inquiry. So that's an interesting one, I think. So our work has always begun with questions. Are we doing a good job? Are we fulfilling the needs of our residents? Are we actually targeting issues of real concern in our cities? And it's not enough, I think, as we thought about who gets to ask those questions. And certainly researchers are privileged to be able to ask those questions, and government, obviously, right? Because we're doing the asking. But the question increasingly has been, what about the role of communities? The people who live in these communities know their communities best and should also be privileged in how they get to ask these questions. And so for us, a community, we are certainly in New Urban Mechanics, a community of inquiry predicated on the idea of community collaboration, working with the community. And one of our projects over the years has been to create a civic research agenda in which we can kind of open the door for colleagues and community members to be part of that community. And thirdly, this idea that we are also a community of care predicated on imagination. I think that we have really begun to see one of the key roles, certainly over this last year. I think we've certainly seen that government must be in the business of care. It must see itself to be in that business, right? So we've always been in that business, whether it's teachers or probation officers or what have you. Care has always been at the center of what we do, although it's not really been acknowledged, right? And I think that's not uncommon in our society. I think care has often been pushed to the margins, right? I think it's often seen as the work of particular people or mothers or what have you, but I think that we need to center on care. It's not just for the edges of our society. And so this idea that we're a community of care predicated on imagination. I think for too long, we've seen cities in the lens of resource optimization, and certainly, the language around smart cities and these kinds of ideas are all centered on the questions of efficiency. And I think that's really out of step with the kind of communities that we're trying to build. Democracy is not efficient, right? Community dialogue is not efficient. And so instead of trying to circumvent those things, we need to engage them and really see them as opportunities for employing our imagination in how we connect with people and the kinds of discussions that we have. So this is roughly how we work. This is kind of a dated depiction of the work, but I think it highlights some of the key elements of what we do. So we have this 3-step way of doing the work. So the first part is that we're actively engaged in exploration, right? So we're talking to people and groups, really anybody that has something to say about Boston. And as we talk to these people, the hope is that we are looking for projects that we think will have impact and that are testable, even in principle. There's lots of good ideas in the world, but oftentimes they're very hard to test. And so New Urban Mechanics, we really see ourselves as the experimentalists in local government. And so we're always looking for these things that we can, for these ideas that we can try and just see if they do actually have an impact on the lives of our community members. And obviously this middle part here, experimentation, is really the sweet spot. We're actively engaged with communities, and we're asking questions together about what it is, what do we want to see, what kind of futures do we want to see in our communities. And as we engage in those kinds of experimental moments, we are also, we're generating insight as to what's going on in these communities. And so this last section is really about sort of evaluating and understanding what we just did. Did this actually have an impact, or did this not? I mean, if it's a bad idea, we should shut it down, right? So failures should not be propagated into the future. And I think this has been a problem for local government. We haven't really had a mechanism for testing out new ideas and dealing with failure. And so in this way, new urban mechanics is a mode in which we can engage in exploration and be experimental and be open to failure. The presumption around here is that when something doesn't work, it doesn't mean that the garbage won't be picked up on Monday or that schools won't work anymore. But the idea here is that we're testing these experiments, and these experiments are scoped so that they will firstly not harm anybody and not wreck systems, but that there'll be tests about how to do things in different ways. The one piece that's missing here as I look at this is we've sort of reorganized this diagram in our latest version, so I apologize. But there should be an arrow that goes from the end to the beginning, and I've been calling that evolution. I like to be alliterative: explore, experiment, evaluate, and evolve. And I think that the intention there is to show that these experiments inform our thinking and allow us, to explore the state of the art and to expand our minds as to what is possible within our cities. And so, how has the last year been for us? It's been a hard year. I mean, it's been a hard year for everybody everywhere. But when I think back over, here we are more than halfway into 2021 and 2020. 2020. It started hard, when we think back at the police killings of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and so on and so on. Certainly this is nothing new in America. This has been happening forever. But to have these things happen in this moment, I think, frankly, as people are at home looking at these issues, it made us think about, one of the things that we heard loud and clear from the public was, this can't continue, that we have to think differently about how we run our city. So more on that later. Obviously, COVID-19, it's been a big issue, continues to be a big issue. So thinking about schools and businesses and safety in public spaces has been a big part of our thinking. The housing crisis in Boston has not gone away. We continue to be a place where middle income people are being forced out of the city. The city is rapidly gentrifying, and this is taken in conjunction with COVID-19. This has caused a huge potential for new kinds of super spreader events and so on. And another crisis that did not go away was the opioid epidemic in this country. This country is being run by cases of opioid overdoses and so on. So that continues to be an area. And so we are actively engaged in working with the health commissions, with our health departments, and redesigning spaces for people who are in various phases of addiction and recovery. And needless to say, our 45th president was a problem. I like to call him POTUS 45 because it sounds weird. I think the influence that President Trump had was profound on American society. Right, we're in a place where we could barely trust each other before, unfortunately, but now even more so. And so these were all issues of huge, of great priority for us. But as we think about it, when we think about one of the things that tied all these crises together, it was really the question of governance. This sounds very nerdy, but I think it's governance in this way of thinking is really the question of how do we make decisions together. So these are questions of collective action. And so we started up, we did a lot of different things, but one of the things that we did, I collaborated with an old friend of mine, Professor Eric Gordon, who runs the engagement lab at Emerson College. And he and I and a few of our friends began to develop this idea that rather than waiting, for these changes to happen or for legislative changes to happen around how decisions get made, we should just do it. We should just try it. And so we reached out to a network of friends and family around the city, and we decided we're going to try to prototype what a network dedicated to experimental and or collaborative governance would look like. And so, there aren't a lot of visuals on this. So, this kind of map-like thing is intended to show that there were many different partners. Certainly government was at the table, academia was at the table, lots of community serving organizations were at the table, and that work continues. And it's something that we're excited about. And I think that in many ways, as I said before, especially given the racial reckoning over the last year, that people were demanding that local government and cities can't continue to work the same. And I think that's 11 minutes or just about 10 minutes. I think I will stop there. I look forward to the discussion. Thank you all.
Thank you so very much, Nigel. That was amazing. And so many of the topics that you and ideas that you discussed resonate so deeply with a lot of the work that I'm doing and many people who are tuning in, I'm sure. So yeah, I love that you talk about how we need governments and institutions to be more attuned with communities in our cities, especially when tackling these wicked challenges that have really pushed us, to the other end of our thresholds and beyond what seems possible anymore, and pushing governments really to think about transitioning out of old status quo ways of thinking, and really embrace, doing things differently and developing these really exciting new communities of practice, of inquiry, of care, embracing new forms of experimentation that open up so many pathways for the way that we think, do, and relate within our cities. So a heartfelt thank you. And so now I'll hand it over to the founder and director of Experimentalista, Gabriella Gomez-Mont.
Hello, everybody. I'm very happy to see you all. So I think my images are loading. Oh, there we go. Okay, perfect. Well, very much following up on Nigel's conversation, I think we're going to touch upon several of the subjects, but I'll take my full 15 minutes, given that I'm always on Mexican time, I guess. So basically, I hail from Mexico City, though right now I'm living in Amsterdam. And as Tanya mentioned, nowadays I direct Experimentalista, which is a creative urban studio building both emerging knowledge structures as well as putting together urban task forces across the world for different subjects. So right now I'm working on several cities on several continents. Everything from Economies of Care with Bogota to expanding typologies for civic spaces in places like Helsinki to night economy with the city of Da Nang. And I think all of this actually had its start with a lot of the things that we did in Mexico City while I was Chief Creative Officer from 2013 to 2018, heading and founding Laboratorio para la Ciudad, the experimental arm/creative think tank for the Mexico City government. And as you probably know, and you'll see Nigel and Boston Urban Mechanics somewhere there, even though this is an old map, we're actually, there's a growing, dying, evolving family of government labs in many cities across the world. And all of us really are brainchilds of the cities where we're at, as well as where exactly in the government structure. So we're different depending on both of those things, but I think we also hold, as you'll see, many things in common. One of them, as Nigel mentioned, is basically trying to do something with this paradox that government gets caught in of saying, okay, on one hand, as citizens, we really want their governments to be solid and sure-footed. But on the other hand, many times governments are lagging 10 to 15 years behind the best ideas out there. So in many ways, these labs actually create a space to mitigate risk. They create a language, they create different types of teams. and bring in new voices, new methodologies, new ways of doing things and looking at the city. And on the other hand, we also create a bridge with civil society. And I think we all hold true that perhaps one of the most underutilized resources that any city has is actually the talent of their citizens. So how can government really start tapping into this? So I led a team of 20 people. Half of us came from the urban and political sciences. The other half of us came from humanities. So everything from urban geographers, data analysts, political scientists, internationalists, lawyers, administrators, working hand in hand with artists, designers, historians, philosophers, writers, editors, futurists, architects, and everything that we did sat in between. Because many times we think of innovation almost in technocratic terms of these specific things to be solved. But I actually think that cities rather are these cultural artifacts. And the big question is, how do we make meaning? And I think, what Jayne and Tanya were saying very much points in this direction. So that was precisely why the composition of my team tried to do this, be this in-between space. And of course, what also made us quite a particular lab was Mexico City in and of itself. We were the first lab in Latin America, the first one in an emerging economy, the first one in a megalopolis. So we had very interesting challenges to face. But I think that one of the questions that kept us all up at night really was this: can we imagine the city from a different place? Because when we want to reinvent things, the first step, I think, is to reimagine and then to experiment our way forward in many senses. So Mexico City in that sense is a very interesting place that to be able to explore all of these questions and ideas, because on one hand, it's one of the biggest city economies of the world, number 14, and it houses the most transnationals in Latin America. But at the same time, 60% of the city actually grew up as an informal city. So this is what 60% of the city still looks like. And the other interesting challenge, being an in-between space, civil society and government, was the lack of trust towards public institutions and even democracy. So this Pew survey that I believe was in 2017 said that only 14% of Mexicans actually believed in democracy, or that we're satisfied with democracy. So as you can imagine, the first experiment that the lab had to do is, how do we become a strange attractor? How do we create a space of trust? Because basically what we needed to do was prototype a collaborative society in many ways. So everything from giving new skills within government, as well as breaking the silos with conferences and workshops. Our rooftop became a place for public discussions and a lot of debates and ideas. We did everything from inserting young hackers for a year within city government to data festivals where we had more than 1,000 people signing up and 100 mentors from within government, to signing agreements with Mexico's top universities for data-driven policy, for example. But we also worked very much on the ground in some of the most marginalized communities in Mexico City. So I think that very much in terms of this governance question and what Nigel was mentioning, I really do think that your community is your superpower. And we saw it over and over and over again. And I think this is the only way forward nowadays that we're facing these huge challenges. But at the same time, we also need to know what we get together for. So how do, instead of thinking about specific ideas or specific solutions for things, what happens is, if our first space that we need to travel into is to imagine that city that we want to become. So my team was actually 6 different teams that were cities, like Open City team, the Playful City team, which is this one, the Pedestrian City team. And so we did everything from doing a policy sweep and seeing what resources were out there in the city. And then we designed and orchestrated whole ecosystems around this. That was everything from academia, government people, my team, obviously, activists, civil society. And then we would sometimes bring in best practices, such as creating the first open data portal for Mexico City. But where our heart really lied was in our portfolio of experiments, because we knew that one thing is not going to get us to that playful city or that pedestrian city, but many things at once. So, for example, we did everything as one experiment of crowdsourcing the largest informal bus system of the world, because we had no map. And we actually had more than 4,000 people signing up. We also did things such as when the Uber taxi debate got super heated in Mexico City with protests and violence and whatnot, we actually created a citywide debate and a methodology to actually draft policy that then was replicated in most of Latin America, and really thinking democracy is actually for the best of times, but also for the worst of times. You need more democracy, not less, when things get convoluted. So that was a really interesting exercise. And for this, we actually also created, for example, this platform with MIT Travis Rich, amazing guy. My team and his team coded this platform that was intended for research and academic papers into a policy tool that was incredibly interesting to do what nowadays is called crowd law, to draft policy together, to do laws together. So for example, that platform, besides the Uber, we also reutilized it in many ways. For example, for the first road safety plan for Mexico City, that we worked with more than 40 organizations and in only 2 years managed to save the city 20% reduction of both important car incidents as well as deaths. But at the same time, we thought that we really needed to be able to give people an experience of the city as well. Like not only the policy needs to be translated into an experience of the city. So simultaneously, when we were doing the hard policy, we were also closing down Mexico City's elevated highway for the first time for cars, for pedestrians and bikes. We were doing these huge bike rides with cultural organizations. We were creating film festivals where people would arrive on bike or walking with Ambulante, who's an amazing documentary film festival. And many times part of what really went through all of our activities was this question of what type of societies do we want and how do we get there? And I think perhaps one of the most interesting exercises and ambitious exercises that we had to ask ourselves this question was actually the crowdsourcing of the Mexico City Constitution, which is now a thing. It's now a legal document, which is amazing. So this was an experiment not only for ourselves, but actually for the world. It had never been done before. Iceland at one point in time gave it a try, but they had a change in government. And so it didn't necessarily pass once the new government was in place. And so basically, this was an incredibly interesting exercise for many reasons that I think caught the attention the world over. I think basically because in a way, drafting a constitution is about the most important legal rights that a citizen can have in a city or in a country. Like constitutional law is par to none. But at the same time, a constitution is also an amazing space to actually think about the ideals and the desires of a city. Like who have we been and who do we want to be? And so basically for this, we had a very multi-tiered participatory scaffolding, because I don't think participation can be one single thing. I think that has been one of the errors of participation, of trying to simplify it to make it easy. Democracy is not easy, and we should actually be as complex as our same cities. So that we can, as Jayne was, or Jacob, Nigel was also mentioning, go beyond these notions of efficiency and drop into something else. So we did everything from, for example, creating a partnership with Change.org, which has millions of users in Mexico City. And there we had more than 500,000 users and 14 petitions that surpassed the 10,000 and 50,000 signatures that actually got together with the mayor or with the group that was actually doing the first draft of the Constitution. And it was incredibly interesting because we also had people who basically had all of these thousands and thousands of people rallying behind their ideas, such as, for example, minimum green space for Mexico City in the case of Patricio. But Patricio was only 17 years old. Like he didn't even have a voting right. And Patricio, to this date, he actually ended up changing careers and is now thinking about what do you do with all of this citizen power? Because he felt incredibly responsible. He just did it on a whim. And then it basically changed his life. And again, like he didn't even have voting age. So it was incredibly interesting to see all of this deliberative process, because besides using the change.org portal, we did try to obviously work on the petitions that surpass the signatures to make them into constitutional material. So they would get together with an incredible group of that the mayor had identified as 28 drafters of the first draft of the Constitution, and then went off to 100 other people. And we had everything from feminist groups to people with disabilities, et cetera, et cetera. And this is a percentage of citizen petitions that actually made it into our final and now, again, like legal draft of the Constitution, which was quite incredible in terms of the effect. But so what does the Constitution do? Because one of the things that we were entrusted with was actually thinking, how do we translate the importance of a Constitution into the street level? So nowadays, besides having a document of aspirations, there's everything from euthanasia laws in place to gay marriage, abortion, adoption by gay marriage, indigenous rights, cultural rights. So there's a whole series of legal rights, including the right to the city, which is just like a beautiful philosophical as well as human rights concept, embedded in our constitution. And this is actually what is still being worked on in terms of the scaffolding of other laws on other rights and other government services that is coming into Mexico City. We have some of the most sophisticated transsexual laws in the whole continent as well, that has really changed the lives of many people on the ground. And then I also had the privilege of also working on Article 20 of the Constitution with a team of the first mayor of Mexico City, actually, who at that point in time was the Minister for Foreign Affairs and his fantastic team. And Article 20 of the Constitution, the Global City, is both new notions of urban diplomacy, where nowadays Mexico City can sign treaties bypassing the federal government. And as we all know, many times nowadays, there's a rift between the federal and local governments. So it's actually really interesting that cities in these transboundary governance structures, if you will, or activist cities joining together for social justice causes has been incredibly interesting. But Article 20 is also sanctuary city precepts. So as you probably heard, when Trump was still in power, midterm elections, there was this huge caravan from Central America fleeing from a lot of violence, a lot of really tricky social things. And the reason why, when they got to Mexico City, instead of being received by the military or the police forces, they were actually received by human rights defenders, by medical services, by having places to stay and food and clothes, was actually because of Article 20 of our Constitution that basically says, as every sanctuary city, that not having the legal papers, especially if you're on the way somewhere to be able to ask for asylum, is not something that the government should pursue as something, you know, where nobody is illegal in that sense when passing through territory. So that was a really amazing way of seeing how this actually becomes an urban and social reality. At the same time, another thing that we did just to get a very quick thermometer was create the Urban Imaginary Survey. So we queried 31,000 people across 1,400 neighborhoods to ask them, what is what you most love about the city? What are the biggest challenges that you find? How do you imagine the future of the city? And so we went door to door, and it was statistically representative, and found some incredibly interesting things. And then we could actually navigate this data by gender, by age, by neighborhood. And this was both a tool for the Constitution to make sure that all of these desires and complaints, if you will, were addressed in some form, but it also became an incredible tool for the lab to actually also figure out what our own priorities should be. But in terms of the question of urban imaginaries, of this imagining the future, it was really interesting that even though we were prompting for positive futures, we mostly got back Mad Max scenarios. And so a question started within the lab of saying, should government care that we cannot imagine a positive future? And I have the feeling that this thing of urban imaginaries is incredibly interesting because nowadays, you know, many times we have smart cities and these notions of efficiency, but is that really what we want out of our cities? Like, is that the best that we can do in terms of how we imagine our future together? So political imagination became an incredibly important subject for us at the lab in many ways. And it's actually been really interesting to see how, in terms of experimentalista now, fast forwarding to what I'm doing now, places like Bogota are asking themselves some incredibly provocative questions, such as this: can a whole city re-articulate itself around care, around economies of care? So this is the mayor of Bogota, where we had a conference just some days ago, actually. She's the first woman gay mayor in Bogota, perhaps the first gay mayor of all of Latin America. And I really love that they have taken about this cause of economies of care and of visibilizing that which remains invisible. Because many times we say, okay, so this percentage of women doesn't work, but actually there's no thing as a woman who does not work. There's only a woman who is not paid for her work. And actually 75% of unpaid care the world over, not only in Bogota, but the world over, is actually done by women. So what does this entail in terms of social justice? So one of the things that they're doing, which I find so ambitious, is creating care blocks. This means actually not only new services and new policy and a new way of thinking about economy, but it actually means restructuring even things such as land use, the physical environment around notions of care. Like, is this not so much more interesting than GDP? I mean, GDP comes in here, but it's not what you're optimizing for, if you will. So this is everything from thinking about this 15-minute city or this proximity city where, you know, it's divided by districts and people have access to everything from daycare, free daycare centers that women can actually, for free, opt into different ways of reskilling so that they can get new jobs, to even creating these places where it's not only that you can go wash your clothes for free and whatnot, but they're also training the men in terms of what we nowadays consider women's work. So there's also this really interesting conversation about the cultural shifts that are needed. And $1 billion, as you can see, is being aimed to shift the burden of care work in Bogota. So these are the creative bureaucrats. This is the team that I'm working on, who are just like this amazing all-women's team that are incredibly impressive. And what we're doing is actually going for the most drastic of these cases, the women that have been living in this pandemic lockdown decades before there was a pandemic, that basically dedicate all of their time to care work. So basically we're inventing what door-to-door services look like, and this is perhaps one of the more experimental bits of it. So how can the city actually unburden and think of the right to free time actually for your most vulnerable population that I won't get into right now. But needless to say, just to wrap everything up, one of the things that I'm most fascinated with when you actually take these types of optics into the conversation is that there can be a shift in deep organizing principles from a logic of economics and efficiency to one of public value and civics. So I just wrote an article for Policy Options because of my senior fellowship with the Canadian Urban Institute, along with Nigel. And here I'm starting to try to tease out what that actually looks like. And what I'd leave you with as a small provocation is, Halifax, what are your urban imaginaries and what could you be optimizing, imagining, and reinventing for? Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for that, Gabriella. That was extraordinary. Wow, did you give us so much to think about in terms of reinventing cities? My head is just buzzing. So everything from, can we imagine the city from a different place? Drafting and crowdsourcing a constitution at city level, looking together honestly and openly at who we have been and deliberate about who we want to be. Care blocks, economies of care. You and Nigel both spoke about care. Can a whole city reorient itself around economies of care? An incredibly inventive question and absolutely essential that we do for the futures we're moving into. And of course, moving from a logic of economics and efficiency to public value and civic value. And that closing provides a perfect bridge to our next speaker, who is Matthew Claudel. And Matthew, a dear friend and who I've known now for a number of years, Matthew worked on his PhD at MIT specifically on developing a theory of civic value. And he also carried out case studies in that, which I'm sure he'll talk about, so I won't talk about those, but that's something I'm really eager to hear more about. And Matthew has just now started a new social enterprise, which is called Field States, which he'll talk about as well. And I can't wait to hear about it. So without further ado, over to you, Matthew, who is live with us in Chapuktuk, Halifax.
Thank you, Jayne. Yeah, we're back to real life. That's a really generous introduction, and I really appreciate it. I really like the title of this conference, The Art of City Building, but specifically the theme of reinvention. We're here because we believe in reinvention. We believe that another city is possible. And we want to sit here together, we want to be here together and imagine generative and not extractive systems. Many of our speakers have been pointing to those. We want to imagine climate vitality, not just resilience. And to do that, we need new approaches to civic infrastructure. When I say infrastructure, I don't just mean the hard infrastructure of cities, and that is extremely important. It's going to be an important part of what I talk about today. But I also mean the governance infrastructures, and those have been alluded to in a lot of the talks today. And I think that's the place that we're at today. We all agree that we need reinvention, but the place we're at is that we need to think about those physical infrastructures, and we need to think about the governance infrastructures. The challenge in doing that is in the doing. What Jen and Engle said this morning, the dreaming and the doing. And that involves scale questions. It involves thinking big, thinking as big as a constitution. And it means thinking as small as a block. It means thinking as small as an outlet on the wall, which I'm going to talk about today as well. So we need to get to the actual building. And that's what I'm going to talk about today, is really how we build some of these civic infrastructures. I'm going to be really concrete. And that means it's not going to be perfect. It means it's still in progress. It means it's an experiment. But I'm really excited about that experiment. So first, what was the old model? What are we working from? What are we reinventing from? And I don't want to belabor this too much. I think we all know what the problems are. But I also think it's important to understand how those systems worked so that we can reconstruct them, we can rewire them. So until now, the orthodoxy that we worked under was this centralized model. This is a bit of a diagram of what that looked like. And this centralized model, it was all about control and it was all about massive scale. This is the basic way we organize government. It's how we organized economic systems. It's how we organize transportation systems and physical hard infrastructures. Frankly, that was a really effective model. It was really good at doing what it did. It worked like magic. It was especially good at consuming resources and turning them into consolidated wealth. This pattern was true across a whole spectrum of different domains and different types of infrastructure, things like food production, waste processing, mobility systems, and energy, power, electricity is a really good example. Electricity is typically produced in giant plants that burn coal or oil. It creates power and gets stepped up to high voltage. It goes through power lines. It crosses hundreds of miles to get to cities because we don't want those power stations in cities. Then it gets stepped down to low voltage in your neighborhood. It goes to your home. This is a classic example of a centralized model. It's big, it's scalable, it can produce a lot of electricity, but it's no longer working well. So this is obvious to all of you, but this is dirty power. Energy is lost at each of those conversion points. The power plant is always overproducing energy because we don't know how many people are going to turn on their light switches. Those high voltage lines that I talked about, they cause forest fires. Many of the recent forest fires in California or in Oregon, where I live, have been caused by high voltage power lines. When the weather is bad, they go down. It's going to happen more and more often. And when too many people are trying to use the system at the same time, it also goes down. These aren't abstract issues. Pacific Gas and Electric, PG&E, is the biggest utility company in California. The cost per kilowatt hour for customers of PG&E has increased by 7% per year since 2009. So the cost is going up. And even so, the company went bankrupt in 2019. So the economic model doesn't work. And the physical model doesn't work either. There's brownouts that are frequent all across California. And severe weather is only making those brownouts worse. So if we go back to our diagram, when you have this massive centralized system, when that middle dot fails, all of these other dots, these individual houses or neighborhoods, they're left stranded. So now you're thinking to yourself, you're like, aha, what if all of those little dots, what if they all have solar panels? What if each dot is not only a consumption unit, but also a production unit? And you can think of this as a completely atomized model. So you go from centralized to atomized. Everyone's on their own. In recent years, rooftop solar has improved. It's now more viable. It's more cost efficient. The batteries are safer. They can provide backup power for a couple days. So what does that mean? It means wealthy people can put solar panels on their homes, buy Tesla Powerwalls, and charge up their Teslas. They can be comfortable for a few days during a power outage. And that's appealing. That's really appealing. And there are a lot of federal subsidies right now across the world, especially in the United States, that are incentivizing rooftop solar. But we can't pretend like this is a solution to the problem. I don't think rooftop solar is going to get us to where we need to go. Photovoltaics, they only work or a full photovoltaic system, it's only going to give you power when the main grid goes out if you have a battery. Batteries are extremely expensive. These kinds of systems as a whole are extremely expensive. And you're not always producing energy when you need to consume it. So think about days that are foggy, think about nighttime. This is usually when you need the most power, and that's usually when your solar panels are not producing. And finally, rooftop solar, it really only happens on single-family homes. It's not only expensive, but it's really difficult to manage for multifamily apartment complexes or other kinds of housing typologies. So that means, again, it's only accessible to wealthy people. So what do? Our goal here is renewable power. And neither the fully centralized model nor the fully atomized model is going to do that for us. So we need a new way of organizing. We need a new approach to civic infrastructure. And we've heard a little bit about what those can look like today. Zita Cobb this morning called it a kind of cauliflower model, a spiral model. We've been thinking of it, I mean, ironically, because she was coming from an island, but we've been thinking about it as an archipelago, many different islands that are all strung together. So go back to that home with solar panels and batteries. At any given moment, I'm in my home and I want to use the microwave. It's foggy out. I'm only producing a little bit of energy. So when I turn on the microwave, the energy comes from the main grid. Now, imagine an alternative where your neighbor also has solar panels and you share a battery. Your neighbor might be at work, not consuming any energy, so when I want to turn on my microwave, I can pull power from my neighbor. This is a basic principle called load balancing. So you're leveling out the peaks and valleys of production and consumption through a shared asset, like a battery and a connected system. So local production and consumption is bundled into communities at the neighborhood scale. This is called a solar microgrid. So this diagram shows one way that a solar microgrid can be set up. You've got a group of, say, 5 to 50 homes. Each of them have individual meters, your ordinary energy meter, and they're sharing a large battery system. A software platform is brokering all of the energy transactions between the homes with the microgrid and also with the main grid. This kind of system is plugged into the main grid. And the system is optimizing for load balance, and that means it's more efficient for everyone involved. And perhaps best of all, microgrid systems are cheaper than a neighborhood full of individual solar panels and batteries because you're installing them all at once. You have a single kind of installation event. As I said before, the microgrid is connected to the main grid. So that provides backup power, and when the neighborhood is consuming more than it's producing, you're just pulling power as usual. And it becomes a revenue-generating infrastructure in the long run because if you're producing net positive power, you can sell it back to the utility. The microgrid can also dump power onto the utility if there's going to be a brownout. So say we know there's a peak demand event, we can dump the battery into the main grid. So this means the main grid is becoming more stable, it's more secure. Over time, as there's more and more of these microgrids, the main grid becomes just a backup. And when the main grid is a backup, you can actually do some incremental updates. You can improve the infrastructure itself, which is impossible now because everyone is relying on that as their only power infrastructure. So the main grid, it will still fail, and if it does fail, each of these microgrids goes into island mode. It becomes a self-sufficient little island. Each home is getting a share of the total power that's being produced, and that's enough for the critical loads. It's not infinite power, but it's enough to charge your cell phone and remain connected to emergency services or kind of run your freezer. So all of this sounds great, and microgrids are actually possible on a technical level. The infrastructure is buildable. We can do this. And I think they also offer a realistic transition pathway. It's not as if we're saying we need to completely replace the energy infrastructure. We need to do away with grids like Pacific Gas and Electric. It's a transitional model. As an organization model, it's a distributed open system. It's like a cauliflower or an archipelago. So now you're looking at me and you're like, this sounds cool. Why don't we see microgrids everywhere? Why isn't everyone doing this? And that's a great question. I mean, it sounds too good to be true. The reality is there are a lot of challenges. The challenges, as I said before, are not really the physical ones. I promised today to talk not just about physical infrastructure. I mean, I've been nerding out on batteries. But I promised to talk about governance infrastructure, and that's really where the challenges are. So one of the big ones is that existing political systems don't do a good job of contemplating shared community assets. So a microgrid is going to be categorized as a utility. That means a neighborhood is treated the same way as Pacific Gas and Electric is, which is ridiculous. They have to comply with the same regulations. They have to do the same kinds of reporting. In other cases, peer-to-peer energy transaction between homes is really the problem, because each home gets categorized as a power plant. Again, that's ridiculous. A power plant needs to have service contracts, and that's a particular kind of legal document. It also disqualifies residents from subsidies for putting solar panels on their houses, because those subsidies are not made for power plants. So these are problems with the existing political infrastructure, the regulations, the policies. There's also a micro-governance question, which is how you get a group of people who happen to live next to each other to share an asset. And that's incredibly challenging. Zita Cobb had this great phrase, the challenge is in the community. How do you get people to manage this? How do you get them to own a piece of a shared asset? You have to deal with the social dynamics. You have to deal with amortization schedules. It's hard to even say, but how long it's going to take me to pay back an infrastructure. You have to deal with resident succession. What if I take up and go? What happens to my piece of the shared infrastructure? And these are big challenges, but they're also perfect challenges for urban planners. That's why I'm bringing them up here, because we care about these sorts of things. So we've launched a new venture that aims to make resident-owned and resident-controlled power infrastructure accessible across an economic spectrum. And that's an incredibly tall order. That's really, really hard. And it means we need to address both the physical and the governance aspects of the kinds of systems I've been describing. So on the physical asset side, we can install groups of solar panels and batteries. And we are building a software platform that tracks individual production and consumption. It's brokering transactions between these homes and with the microgrid and with the main grid. This software decides when to buy power, when to sell power, and it's showing everything kind of on a dashboard. But the real innovation, the really interesting part of what we're doing, is the legal side. So for each one of these microgrids that we're helping to set up in neighborhoods, we're also helping to set up a legal entity called a perpetual purpose trust. This is a lot like a community land trust. And it allows people to own a shared asset and to manage that shared asset together. So as we heard earlier, it matters who owns what. And through a PPT, the residents are owning that almost a local power plant. They're owning their energy commons. Residents are trustees, and each one of them has a voting share in how this is managed. And the PPT holds that shared infrastructure in trust, which means that in the legal document, you have to declare what the purpose of this thing is. And the PPT has a fiduciary responsibility to ensure that that purpose is met, and that can be cheap, sustainable power for the neighborhood in perpetuity. So we're really excited about what this means for energy systems. We're excited that it points to a future of renewable energy in a kind of archipelago model that you see here. And we're excited because it's a realistic transitional pathway to shifting toward renewable energy. But I'm actually most excited about this for those big reasons, the Constitution scale reasons. These communities are capturing the value of a shared asset. They're actually producing as much as they're consuming. They're using structures for local governance and shared control. They're having to deal with the problems of getting along. And I think that repercusses outward beyond what it means to have a solar panel and plug in a power outlet. That means you start to build a familiarity. It means you have a shared stake in the place you live. It means you have an incentive to stay in the place you live. And I think that's a new way of thinking about how we're organizing cities. It's a reinvention. I also think that once we flex that muscle, once we build that capacity, the same archipelago model, the same conceptual organization can apply to all sorts of other things, like food production and consumption. Another example, a real example, is communities in New York City and Toronto, some of the biggest cities in the world, that are using the same approach to deliver high quality and affordable resident-owned broadband access, NYC Mesh and Toronto Mesh. You could imagine systems like this for truly peer-to-peer vehicle sharing, connected by interregional, larger scale shared infrastructures like trains. So I think this archipelago model is a way of organizing civic infrastructure that enables distributed control and open scale. This is a fractal. It can be scaled as big as you want, unlike that centralized diagram. It's creating local efficiencies, but it's also a generative system. It's not an extractive system. It's not a centrally controlled one. So I'm going to leave you with this. I think that we're on the edge of a revolution in how cities are organized. We need to do the process of reinvention, and that's why we're here. But I believe we can imagine distributed open systems for both building and governing urban infrastructures. And I believe that these can be sustainable. I believe they can be vital. And I believe that they can create shared local value. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Matthew. That was wonderful. I just love thinking about starting a revolution based on reinvention, driven by reinvention, believing that another city is possible based on renewable energies, which I tend to geek out on a bit as well, and renewable energy pathways that are owned and governed by residents based on distributed open systems, archipelago models, and shared assets. I love the idea, and of course we talk about it a lot, that we're trying to transition beyond these really centralized, large scale extractive systems that consume resources, both natural and labor, and consolidate wealth, and maybe they've worked, for a very small percentage of our societies, but they're not sustainable. They're incredibly inequitable and destructive to both ecosystems and communities, especially those that bear the costs and burdens of these forms of production, accumulation, and consumption. So, this new vision of infrastructure and energy solutions that are a transitional pathway for new forms of participatory governance, especially your example of resident-owned and controlled solar microgrids and perpetual purpose trusts, community broadband networks are such tangible and inspiring examples. Thank you so very much. And so I think now we're going to hand it over to Aimee Gasparetto, who is the program manager for the Mi'kmaq Friendship Center of Chipuktuk, Halifax, and Pam Desrochers, who's the executive director of the Mi'kmaq Friendship Center in Chipuktuk, Halifax. Aimee? Pam?
Great.
And they're both in person. Yay.
Great, thank you, everyone. So my name's Aimee Gasparetto. I'm program director at the Mi'kmaq Native Friendship Center, and I'll just say I grew up and live and continue to work here in Halifax, which is the unceded and traditional lands of the Mi'kmaq people. So I'm going to share a very specific piece of work that I've been focused on and is emerging here in Halifax, which is about a vision for co-created and cooperative neighborhoods, and one that aims to center reconciliation in civic infrastructure that's purpose-built for social cohesion and inclusive participation in more circular and localized economies. And it calls on us to consider very important questions around the interface between the physical infrastructure that supports us to live and move around and the social infrastructure, which speaks to the human experience of the physical form, with value that gets manifested through the quality of our relationships and the social networks across the physical spaces we inhabit. So as I think about our theme of reinvention today, the questions I'm called to ask are this: how might cities and neighborhoods be designed to amplify social networks and leverage the power of socially connected places? And what if reconciliation became something we lived into daily through our relationships and everyday participation with neighbors? In the boroughs of Barking and Dagenham in East London, UK, a new system of inclusive participation is emerging, and it's redefining what's possible for how we live and work together. The organization behind it is Participatory City, which dedicated more than 10 years of research to a platform approach around building participation culture at the scale of neighborhoods. Their research has resulted in one of the largest demonstration projects in the world that's engaging thousands of residents in a growing network of neighborhood projects and businesses, all together contributing to the first large-scale, fully inclusive participation ecosystem. Thank you. A defining feature of Participatory City is an extensive and well-coordinated support platform, including 5 essential ingredients that, when combined, make it possible for many different residents to start and grow collections of neighborhood projects and become co-creators of the places in which they live. These ingredients include a set of infrastructures, including both physical spaces, support elements, and teams to work shoulder to shoulder with residents, as well as regular newspaper cycles and data collection processes. And as the support platform expands, it creates the conditions for a growing number of people to take part in co-creation activities, making them collaborators and co-producers as well as consumers. The resulting participation ecosystem acts much like a living and breathing ecosystem, where projects start, evolve, and die based on resident needs and interests. So over the last 5 years in London, this platform of connected infrastructures has lifted citizen participation to incredible heights, with direct and immediate effects resulting from daily involvement in these kinds of activities, like saving money and strengthening social ties, as well as collective effects for many different people doing many small things, like caring for the environment. And finally, with networked effects that emerge from many people knowing and trusting each other. So in 2020, Halifax became one of 3 Canadian cities to serve as testing grounds for the adaptation of this approach in Canada, and at the same time, a national platform was created called Participatory Canada. Our work was initiated through a partnership of well-established organizations, and it was collectively articulated that while we would build upon nuanced approaches and insights from London, it would also be essential to honor our unique local and national context. And specifically, this included an exploration into how a platform approach to inclusive citizen participation could center reconciliation and be inclusive to all. The commitment to center reconciliation means to do so across our work with partners, with institutions, and with residents in neighborhoods. Fundamentally, it's about how reconciliation can be mobilized on the ground with local government as a catalyst, but certainly not by them alone, and demonstrating how the development of civic and social infrastructure can support goals related to reconciliation rather than work against them. So the Mi'kmaq Native Friendship Center is leading the implementation of the work on the ground, aligning the vision with that of a new friendship center that's being developed in the heart of Halifax, a space that will welcome the whole community and be connected to a joined-up platform that extends across the city and nurtures new ways of living and learning together. So over the course of 6 months, a small team worked with local residents to design and develop a mini support platform. It included functional spaces connected across an area of Halifax's North End, ideas and resources to stimulate a network of practical participation projects, as well as our first newspaper, which we distributed to 3,500 households nearby. The newspaper alone sparked excitement and interest as it helped residents to see a wide range of interesting activities happening nearby, with local people offering their skills, time, and talents to make it happen. And over time, the newspapers play a central role, not only to communicate the breadth of projects, but also to spread a unique and optimistic narrative about the neighborhood and the people who live there. The result was 8 project themes, a variety of resident-led activities that aim to spark meaningful and inclusive participation, where common denominator activities support neighbors to connect over shared interests and make life easier through networks of peer learning and support, where participation is built into the fabric of everyday life based on activities that are useful and enjoyable and easy to take part in based on their frequency and one's proximity, and where pathways are established for residents to become key decision makers around the use of public lands and infrastructures. And this, without question, is difficult work, because if we increasingly live in more diverse communities with many more people needing to coexist and thrive in shared spaces. But if I can make a single point, it would be this. Before we start to think about what we want our cities and neighborhoods to be, we first need to ask ourselves some very big and critical questions, like who is it that gets to decide? And who or what are we accountable to? Who actually owns our cities and who belongs in our cities? If some of those answers are that people own our cities and that we're responsible for shared ownership and accountability frameworks that factor in the earth that sustains us, the systems and structures we build will have very different forms. More than anything else, we heard appreciation for opportunities to connect with people living nearby and explore the neighborhood in a new way. While these activities can seem very ordinary, like neighborhood walks or learning to sew your own COVID masks, they're meaningful because they're based on the skills and the talents and the interests of local people. It's the combination of invitations, infrastructures, and co-design process that creates a level of radical inclusivity that is the starting place for everything. So while the projects vary, they're united in their focus to share community wisdom and build skills and confidence and foster collective agency. To get to co-created neighborhoods, citizens need the basic tools and support to work together, to create and ultimately build a sense of pride and ownership that becomes possible with meaningful contribution. One of the most encouraging pieces emerged in working with elders, as well as Friendship Center staff and community members to create opportunities for cultural knowledge to be shared and celebrated through culturally infused participation projects. In this intentional co-creation of spaces and experiences, we saw a glimpse of what we could be doing more of to support meaningful connections and cross-cultural sharing between Halifax's urban Indigenous community and the community at large. In part, it's about getting to know one another in ways we haven't before, but it's also about co-creating the social, cultural, and ecological assets that help to connect us to the parts of life that are bigger than ourselves and build a shared sense of togetherness. Across the globe, Participatory City and others are demonstrating that with access to the right spaces, equipment, opportunities, and support, people will produce ideas and projects you may never think possible. But all too often, the idea of innovation feels out of reach for so many, or something that's attainable for small groups like entrepreneurs. But community innovation is something we can tap into when we build and connect civic infrastructure that is designed to draw on the ideas and strengths of many different people. And this is why social infrastructure matters. While there are different definitions, a rather simple one refers to the places and spaces where people gather to connect, to learn, and to support each other. I would build on this to specify that social infrastructure also refers to the relationships, the structures, and systems that layer into physical infrastructure and work to humanize it. So in reimagining what we want our cities to become, I call on us to think about the transformative power of participatory social infrastructure. It's one of the building blocks for social cohesion, which I've heard described once before as the demonstrated cooperation and collaboration of all types. Also important here is that when we nurture social cohesion, we also strengthen our collective capacity to respond to change, to reinvent, and to transform. An example of this can be seen in the storefronts that have been developed in Barking and Dagenham and will be part of the next phase of development for Halifax. So these neighborhood shops are accessible, welcoming spaces that are open for all, and entice people passing by to come in for a cup of tea, which is often where it begins. From there, they become familiar with the shops as places to gather, to make, and to create. They serve not only as co-working and gathering spaces, but also as public maker spaces. And in essence, the shops are located and designed to show what public infrastructure could look like if it were shaped around people and their natural instincts to engage with one another and the world around them. As the system builds, this hyper-localized infrastructure can be connected to other spaces, production warehouses and retail venues that expand support for projects and open the door for more inclusive economic activity with collaborative business programs. There's a critical link and often missed opportunity between citizen participation and building a more inclusive and localized economy. I think many can agree that social and economic development are essential, but all too often they're siloed within institutional frameworks. So why not build systems that weave social and economic development together, enabling more people to contribute to and benefit from both? I believe the stories we tell ourselves and hear from one another inform a broader cultural narrative that influences whose lives are valued and whose are not. So a critical piece of this work is to influence and shift this narrative, putting people and their well-being as well as the planet at the heart of how we think about and design for cities. In this tiny experiment, I observed that the platform exists not only to harness the power of creation and connection, but also foster the emergence of story and storytelling. Stories that illuminate the voices of many different residents and can inform our collective beliefs around who lives in our communities, what they value, and ultimately who belongs. Together, these stories build an optimistic narrative about residents and how they're working together to shape the everyday experience of life in the neighborhood. In a project we called Tea and Bannock, we worked with elders to share their experience and wisdom through informal conversations. Sometimes it was a teaching, and other times it was a deeper dive into conversations about life or the neighborhood. But what we heard and saw from all of these is that when people are given a platform to share stories of themselves on their terms, it helps to nurture connections in small but very significant ways. We began this work with many different partners coming together to learn how this approach could center reconciliation and be inclusive to all. And if anything has become clear, it's that this will surely need to happen across multiple levels, relationships, and institutions. With local residents, fostering networks of relationships and friendships, and enabling the things that we value, such as culture or connection to nature, to be reflected in the places we live and the things we do together. And with an ecosystem of local, national, and international actors, with much work and learning to be done around how we decolonize ourselves and the institutions we're part of, to nurture new models of stewardship and shared ownership, and make way for cities not designed for populations, but for generations, past, present, and future. Having spent most of my career in the social sector, I'm deeply aware of the power of place-based organizations and their role in building and maintaining critical social networks. So in the face of COVID-19, this reality was taken to new heights when community-based organizations and their networks became a safety net for so many. So I asked what we can learn from this. We need systems of shared infrastructure, physical, social, digital, that create the conditions for people to work together as forces for good in their own neighborhoods, with accessible tools, resources, and spaces to collectively create not only the products, but also the networks of cooperation that are the building blocks for a healthy, sustainable society. Our work to date has resulted in interest and commitment for Halifax to become the site of a deep demonstration learning campus. And over the next 3 years, we aim to complete the prototyping and evaluation of this approach in one of Halifax's most diverse urban communities. We hope it will see the development of a large-scale participation ecosystem that can be nested within the new Wajaywiyan Center and extend across the city to welcome everyone. And when I was invited to speak here today, I was asked to share my ideas about the reinvention of cities. And for most of this talk, I'm focusing on the what of this question. But truthfully, before we can get on to this, I'd suggest we begin to focus on the for what and the for whom. What is our shared purpose for reinventing the cities in which we live? Perhaps it is about restoring a set of values that prioritizes things that have been lost or maybe once were, or maybe never were, values such as justice, healing, or regeneration. Or perhaps it is about reclaiming the inherent rights and power of all people, or dare I say, the rights and sacredness of nature. I'd suggest that if we can collectively re-articulate the very reasons that cities exist, the pathway to reinvention will become much more clear. Thank you.
Thanks, Aimee. Aimee does the presentation and I do storytelling, just so everybody knows. Thank you so much, Aimee. That's a really good jumping off point for me. Someone very smart once told me that some of the best projects die on the floor because they can't be pushed over the finish line without a lot of extra help. And these are those kinds of projects. We have seen, from my own perspective, for 10,000 years, I've seen my community work hard to sustain our own communities. We were stewards of the land. And when we were redeveloping the new Friendship Center, that was a very key piece of what my community wanted to see. We engaged with elders, we engaged with all kinds of communities right across the province, and that was one of the largest pieces, was us becoming stewards of who we are and where we're going. And that the Wajaywian Center is just that. It is about us moving forward together. It is about us offering a space to bring Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples together, to have tough conversations, but to also allow us to grow and become part of each other. We all work, live, and play in urban context. We have one of the largest urban populations east of Toronto, here in Halifax, and it's growing. And this is our home. My home is in the urban context. It's not in Millbrook First Nations, where I'm a First Nations band member. It's where my parents are. It's where my brother is. This is my home. And I want it to continue to be the home of my grandkids, but I also want it to be sustainable for my community. It was about us building and having the opportunity to build the capacity within my community. This project is actually a very old way of teaching. This is a project that teaches from the community level. That is how we taught in my community generations ago. We've lost that. So this became very excitable to me to do this work, to find a way that we can all come together and be part of something bigger and better. I've asked the mayor to take a leap of faith with me on many occasions, Develop Nova Scotia, and all of our great partners that we work with. I always say, let's just take a leap of faith. Close your eyes and let's take a jump and see where we land. And that's scary for a lot of people, because people like to see where they're landing. But we keep doing the same things over and over and over. So we do have to jump in different spaces. We do have to push outside the limit. And sometimes you don't get to see where we're going to land, but it's worth it. I'm going to tell you right now, it's going to be worth it in the long run. Our cities, COVID has certainly opened up a lot of secrets, we'll say, to people outside of the not-for-profit world if you're working in housing and homeless, addictions, mental health, which I live and breathe every day. So those things have all been pushed forward, and it's in front of us every day now. So we have to start doing things differently. We're talking about human beings. We're talking about our environment. We're talking about the land, the sea, the fish, the animals. We talk about instant nogama. That's all my relations. And it's not just my people that I'm talking about. It is my relationship to the land, the water, the seas, the animals. Because we are all related in one way or another. So I only have a few minutes here today, but I will tell you this. As we move forward as a society, we do need to change, and we need to be inclusive. And right now, quite often, there's always the divide, and it's always economic. It's always money. That's going to shift. As our environment shifts, it's going to be about survival, And it's going to be about how do we move forward and how do we do this differently. And we will be forced to do it differently. It's already happening. You see the environment, the impact on that. You know, my father, who has fished his entire life, I was out with him the other day on his boat. He's 81 years old and he scares me to death. I don't know how he does what he does. But he was sitting there telling me the stories of when they used to mackerel fish and the size that they used to have. And of course, I like to fish. I enjoy it. But it saddened me deeply as I was catching fish and realizing the size of what is out there now. So the impacts are here and we're seeing more and more of it. And you hear the generations of people like my father who are now the elders in community telling these stories of the way things used to be and how we were supposed to be responsible for all of that. And how, and you know, another really good point is within the Mi'kmaq language, and actually I would challenge most people who, any indigenous language, there's very few languages that actually have a word for homelessness. There is none. And that says a lot about the responsibility that we have as Indigenous people, but certainly I don't think that responsibility is just on us, it's on all of us. You all have relations, you all have instant nogama. All of your generations are there with you at all times. And we're becoming part of the next generation where my grandkids are going to be looking after what we've done for them. So it's these types of thinking. I don't know where Matt went. Where did he go? Okay. So anyways, Matt's thought process of that shared asset is so important for us to recognize and to start thinking very differently. I challenge all the time, you know, we need to start looking at land differently. Land ownership is made up. They're imaginary lines somebody created a long time ago. It's like that line right there. It's not real, but somebody created land, the land ownership system that we have. One time the land was for the community. And we will go there again, because I think we'll be forced to go there again. But I have to say, listening to a lot of the activity and the conversations today gets me excited because people are already thinking about these things. We just need to get people to listen and understand. And I'll go back to my original statement. There's a lot of great projects here, and the way to carry them forward is we all have to carry them forward so that one person isn't doing all that hard work alone. And I think today you see that in a lot of these little projects that have been talked about. They're small in scale, but can be huge impacts as they expand and go from city to city to city. I love Halifax, I love it, I think it's beautiful. We've had conversations. I'd never seen myself down on the waterfront. Wasn't my space, it's not where I belonged. But we all belong there. We all should see ourselves in the cities that we live, work, and play. And we're doing a lot of hard work behind the scenes to change that way of thinking. We need to change our way of thinking of, it's all ours. We are all responsible for it. At the end of the day, the land owns me. I don't own the land. And I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful that someday I get the opportunity to give back to the land when time comes. So I'm thankful for all of these conversations today. And I'm excited to see, you know, what gets reimagined, because I think there's real opportunity. We do have a beautiful city. And you see some of the great work that's being done. And I think that's a real opportunity for us. And I know, seeing Frank the other day, Frank, I just want to say hi to you again, because Frank actually started, a long time ago, Frank and his team did a project with us. And some of the conversations that we had started me thinking really differently. And I'm thankful for those conversations. So I'm going to leave it at that. Instant Nogama. Thank you. Wala leo.
Wow. Thank you, Aimee and Pam, for those incredibly powerful, moving presentations, also informative. What you have shared is so fundamental to our working together on truth and reconciliation and on us collectively and together reinventing. And I've had the wonderful chance to work with Aimee and Pam over these past couple of years, including on this work. And I have been transformed by the experience. And learning alongside Pam has been one of the gifts of my life. And one of the things that we have talked about so much from the very beginning of this is if we recognize truth and reconciliation as one of the most important journeys we are on as societies, I'd add it as a precondition for reinvention, then what does that mean at city level? What would it mean to manifest reconciliation at city level? There's been lots of talk about reconciliation in this country for a long time now, and yet we still don't actually see it and live it and breathe it every day. It's not fully in the DNA of how we live and work together. How could it be Indigenous-led, Indigenous-centered, and radically inclusive of everyone? So that's really what's been at the heart of this work. As Aimee said, civic infrastructure, which is purpose-built for social cohesion. Also, again, the theme of centering care in local ways of living and in local economies. And it's about humanizing social infrastructure so that reconciliation is something we live into daily through our relationships, through everyday participation with each other. And as Pam tells me, almost every time we meet, Jayne, this is not new. This is not new. This is based on traditional ways. This is simple. We know this. This is intuitive for us. And yet, the rest of us have evolved in ways that do not support this way of living and working and being together. So we see this as a wonderful and transformative opportunity. Again, very practical and also about systemic structural reinvention. Okay, so I would like to move into some questions. We have about 10 or 15 minutes for some questions. And so I will kick that off. If there are audience questions, please do submit them live, however you've been told to submit them. And but we have plenty if not. I see people coming to the stage to sit down. I love this hybrid here. Going pretty well, touch wood. Okay, wonderful. So for those of us paying attention in this country or even outside of Canada today, it happens to be a federal election here. And it really strikes me how different these discussions are from much of what we hear at federal level, right? I kind of wish I was voting for the people who just spoke in this panel, to tell you the truth. There's been so much talk from speakers about reinventing economies, democratic institutions, infrastructures from the city up, where we live, where we know each other, where we interact. And you've also mentioned trust and how we're suffering from increasing lack of trust, increasing lack of meaning of democracy. So my opening question is this. Do we have the institutions we need, or how must they change the ones that exist so that they're reinvented to support the kind of civic economies and democracies that each of you have spoken to in a different way? And how to build or complement the good that exists while also building for much better reinvented futures in ways that are deeply systemic, transformative, collective, radically inclusive. That's a big question. You've all spoken to it a little bit, but I'd love to hear a few leverage points, either at nation state or federal levels, that could give cities the agency to reinvent their economies and democracies in ways that you've talked about. Who would like to start? I'm inclined to invite Pam if you'd like to start. If you wouldn't, I'd go to Matthew.
Yeah, thanks, Jayne. That's a huge question. And the reality is, you know, we need all levels of government. I'm broken.
It might be just turning on them. I don't even know if my mic's on.
He said he turned it on.
Oh.
It's red though.
We can pass the mic too. Oh, no, I'm on.
I broke it already, see? Is it on?
Yeah, I mean, I can hear myself.
Yeah, okay, well. Are we ready? I lost my thought process, that's all right. Welcome to the world of Zoom and technology, right? Thanks, Jayne. That is a huge question, though. From where I come from, trust is always a huge issue when it comes to all levels of government. Coming from the Indigenous perspective, it's a huge challenge. There's a lot of promises that always seem to get broken. But when it comes to these kinds of issues and conversations, this isn't just about Indigenous peoples. This is about all of us. This is about our communities as we move forward together. And the reality is we need all levels of government to engage in this and to have these kinds of conversations. What I have discovered the last 18 months or more with COVID is quite often we're always blocked with, well, that's legislation, we can't change that, we can't do that, but boy, oh boy, COVID sure did show us those can change in a heartbeat when needed, if the will and the political will is there. So I think the will needs to be there, and I think as communities, we're going to be the ones to do that pushing and that heavy lifting. We are going to have them engage with us in a way that they're not used to. We're literally changing how government thinks and what a priority is. We're talking about shifting how people see communities. I come from a very marginalized community. And quite often, in reality, people see us as a drain on society. So we're actually shifting how people see us and see those people who are marginalized, that we're not a drain on society, that we have the capacity, we have the education, we have the knowledge to help shift and ensure that our communities become something new and exciting, and that it is about communities, and it is about changing and shifting the use of land. It is about shifting and changing the use of access to water, resources. And I think that can be done, and I think it will be done. Or I wouldn't do what I do, I guess, really. It's a thought process that I believe that community should always come first. We have to remember that some of our most marginalized people that we deal with are direct impacts for myself from the Indian Act. So Friendship Center has 45 plus programs, and every one of them are linked to the Indian Act. So you're shifting what community can do, and you're building the capacity for us to become resilient and for us to become self-determinate in how we act with each other and how we work and play together as well.
Thanks for that, Pam. That's really rich. And, you know, I've seen you engaging, especially in the past couple of years, more at federal level as well, in ways that it seems like you're already doing this intuitively. You're engaging on some, you know, federal advisories, like around national housing strategy and so on, which then have implications at local level. So I think that's that's a really practical way of intervening in what you're saying. So that's great. Just before we move to a question from Tanya, I'd like to see, is there another person, another speaker who has a burning desire to answer that? I see Nigel's hand.
I don't know about a burning desire, but it is a big question. And so I think the answer to your question is yes and no. So again, I'm going to talk, although I'm Canadian, I will talk about the US. I'm more familiar with how things work down here. I think between COVID-19 and President Trump, we've crossed a line in the sand. Americans can no longer talk to each other. I think there is almost no America at this point, right? There's the Northeast and the Southwest and whatever happening in the middle. It's just divergent. But that also means there's this moment, I think, where we can reset. I think there is this moment where we can find ways to have these conversations. You know, my sense is that people's expectations have changed. There's a lot of Americans who are first generation, right? I mean, this is a city, this continues to be a country of immigrants and migrants. And so I think that a lot of these people have different expectations about what government is and what community is and so on. And a lot of people will find that threatening, certainly. If the last year is an indication, but I think that's also an opportunity to talk about what do we have expectations of the community that we live in and what role should they be playing. I think there is also the question of like institutions, you know, so I think a lot about the role of universities in addition to local government. Institutions, obviously, you know, Boston has a lot of universities. There's Harvard and MIT and Northeastern, Boston University, and all of those universities, I'm going to call you out here, university friends, but all of you have done a pretty bad job of engaging with your communities. You own substantial chunks of the city. You don't pay taxes on it. That's an American thing, but it also means there's an opportunity for you all to re-engage and to understand the people whose lives are directly impacting, right? I mean, the population influx in Boston is huge in the school year. So I think there is this moment, we've talked a lot about reinvention, and I think reinvention is certainly where we are. And I think that requires imagination. I think Gabriella talked before about political imagination. I think social imagination, civic imagination, there's this moment, and that means there's this role for artists and for writers to help us sculpt those ideas and to sort of give language to what some of that could be. So I'm hopeful, again, talking more about the US than I am about Boston. I'm hopeful for Canada too. Most of my family still lives there, but yeah, so I think there are ways forward in the US.
Thanks for that, Nigel. Well, saying there is no America is really strong. It also leaves space for this being reclaimed as Turtle Island, doesn't it? And lots of space for reinvention there. So thank you for that. I'd like to, Tanya, would you like to go to an audience question for speaker?
Thank you, everyone. So we have a question from the illustrious Mary Rowe of the Canadian Urban Institute. She has a question that she's putting before, I guess, all members of the panel. How much priority should we be placing on public policy changes versus on the ground prototyping or pilots? Would anyone like to kick us off? I see Nigel nodding, or Gabriella.
I can give it a go. I'd be happy to. No, it's a great question, and one of the things that I saw both in my work in Mexico City as well as right now working with the mayor's team in Bogota is first of all, there's already some incredibly interesting things happening on the ground. In terms of Mexico City, for example, since it's such a sprawling city, a 9.5 million people city proper, 21 million people in the metropolitan area, 6 million people coming in every day. So it has a lot of pockets of invention and reinvention. Actually, there's so many communities that have their own governance systems in many ways, that have been utilizing their own forms of land trust, their own ways of self-organization, their own ways of dealing both with the lack of resources and being inventive about it. As we will say, you know, many times creativity, rather that need is the mother of all creativity. And at the same time, also, I think a lot of things that we can learn from in terms of how to articulate a much healthier relationship between what government can do to actually support this, because, you know, many of these community members also talked to us when I was at the lab about something that they called civic fatigue, which I think is a really interesting concept of saying, okay, like, you know, I've been happy to do this 20 years, but how long am I going to do it bootstrapped and in my free time? And, you know, so there is a social cost many times that I do think that we should be reconfiguring what those governance structures look like and how to best support what is already happening on the ground. In those terms, in terms of the Constitution that I spoke about, the indigenous rights, which is Article 59, if I remember correctly, actually gives the right to self-determination to indigenous population in Mexico City, which is also, it also exists on a national level in terms of saying, if you have your own way of dealing with your political systems, your social systems, your use of land, as long as it doesn't go against federal law, you can actually abide by it. So in many ways, one of the really interesting things that I believe needs to happen is really understanding what we can learn from what is happening on the ground, which is kind of like part of the first question, which I'll bridge towards Mary's. In Bogota right now, one of the interesting things that we're seeing is there's a lot of policy changes that I'm mentioning. You know, the Sistema Distrital de Cuidados, which is kind of like the official name, policy name for rearticulating the whole of Bogota around care, is now being debated as they are rethinking their land management plans, I think it's called in English. I think I'm being very sloppy with my translation, but you know what I mean, you know, just like figuring out land use and how you're going to articulate the city for the next 14 years, I think it is in Bogota. So that has given some really interesting discussions, because both in those terms, as well as this experimental space that we are creating in terms of, as I mentioned, like the women that have been under the most extreme case of care work, that really have their full time is dedicated to this. We're going through a prototyping phase, and there's already a lot of policy changes. But one of the things that we're seeing is that we're learning so much from prototypes, both of how you need to rearticulate the silos within government, how even simple things like, or rather not simple things, but complicated and very entrenched things such as procurement processes, how does that even go about? One of the things that we have right now with the prototyping, because of Bogota is one of the finalists for the mayor's challenge, for Bloomberg's mayor's challenge, is that we actually have some funds to try out these things beforehand. And we have the chance to actually work with the providers of services to the government in terms of, instead of going full on to a service that we think we know what that needs to look like, we're prototyping with them, with the community, with the care workers, with the people that they care for, with the neighborhood, and all of this then can go back into policy. So I actually think in some that it is incredibly symbiotic, and that perhaps both things need to happen at once, or three things need to happen at once: what already exists and how do we transition to making it even stronger? B, yes, let's prototype and do policy changes, but then how does that one thing feed into the other continuously, I'd say.
Thank you so much, Gabriella. And for the sake of time, I will just turn it over to Nigel. You look like you wanted to respond as well, Nigel.
I mean, as always, I agree with Gabrielle, but I think when I think about the work that's happening in the local level around the world, it's really inspiring and it's really exciting. And I think that's what we need to rethink the way public policy works. I think for too long, public policy has set the agenda. I think it should be more flipped, so that people who are writing policy are looking towards these local examples and saying, well, this is really having an impact. Even in principle, how could we enable that in a broader context? So I think that the more that, you know, the on-the-ground institutions can engage in experimentation of a variety of sorts, I think we'll be able to figure out, you know, it's always been interesting to me when, you know, I used to work in startups before I did this work, and people often hit me with the question or the notion that, like, I don't think what you're talking about is the role of government. And my answer is always, how would we know? Like, how can you possibly know that? Why isn't this a process of invention? Like, shouldn't we be exploring that line? What is or what isn't government? I mean, so I think really that's we should be thinking differently about how we do public policy, at least in this country, and I would imagine in Canada as well.
Great, thank you so much, Nigel, and to our panel members who are at the library. So Pam, Aimee, or Matthew, would anyone like to respond to Mary's question?
Sure, yeah, thank you. I absolutely agree, and I want to pick up on a couple of things that, that Gabriella and Nigel said. And I think this question actually also gets at Jayne's original question. And I think policy needs to come in the beginning, and it needs to come at the end of processes that are local and on the ground. And that's something both of you alluded to. I think policy in many cases stands in the way of an experiment, and it stands in the way of doing something on the ground. And in those cases, we need to very carefully figure out ways of working within or around policy. And in some cases, that's a government lab, like you showed earlier. In other cases, it's regulatory experimentation, relaxing regulations around a specific and controlled and therefore safe trial. And so, this is a growingly common rhetoric about experimentation. And I think what's missing in a lot of experiments is two things. One is the trust building, and we saw that happening with Participatory City and Participatory Canada, the kind of starting with trust building as a goal. Because, the saying goes, change happens at the speed of trust. And that's often missing in our experiments. The other thing that's missing is embedding seeds of how a system could be different. Often we tailor an experiment to figure out an answer to a particular problem, like food security or community power, or whatever the case may be. But because we're so focused on that goal, we sort of miss how that goal in the future, in perpetuity, could be enabled by new kinds of policy. And so in our experiments, if they're truly going to be Trojan horses, we need to embed alternative visions of how policy could function and how that could cultivate an ecosystem of this experiment growing. The other thing that these experiments often miss is an actual model for making that happen, right? Experiments are often special snowflakes. And this is perhaps going to be polemic in this audience, but I do think experiments need to figure out what the business model is. That's so often missing. And that business model, I absolutely believe it needs to be a different kind of business. It needs to be a reimagined form of corporation. It could be, here in Nova Scotia, I was looking into a corporate form called a community interest company, which is different than a for-profit. It's different than a nonprofit. You have things in Canada like a social utility trust, which has a fiduciary responsibility to a particular kind of social utility. And so I think our experiments need to have these components, and then policy needs to come after. It needs to say, okay, this worked. Now how do we pave the runway for that kind of thing to grow in the future? And that takes a lot of trust. A lot of trust within the community, within the group of experimenters and those who are subject to the outcomes of the experiment, but also trust on the part of government. This is going to be different. It's not going to be a standard service contract. We need to think about procurement. We need to think about how we're constructing power purchasing contracts or food system regulation. And that's going to take a lot of change at the municipal level.
So I'm going to throw a monkey wrench in there because I do. So for myself, because policy quite often dictates what Indigenous communities can and cannot do, right from the Indian Act, right through to creation of residential schools, 60 Scoop, all of that. Policy is quite often written in a way that does not allow Indigenous communities to thrive or to try things differently or do things differently. You can't own your own home on most First Nations community. There's a lot of, government has a right to override a will of my parents if they so choose, if they're living within the community. So there's a lot of policy there that I often find actually holds communities back from doing projects or innovation. So I'm always I'm on the flip side. I want to do, because that's how we get things done. And then the policy should be written alongside of doing, so that marginalized communities are not left out of those processes. Quite often policy through institutions, universities, some of the most colonized systems that we have, and oldest colonized systems we have, often can't see past those systems. So we have to push back and we have to do things and get things done as quickly as possible, because we're always the ones trying to prove that this will work. And so there is a difference, I think, depending on where you come from. My life experiences are very different than most people's, than Aimee's, the Matt's, and everybody here. And if you're an Indigenous person, from the day you're born, you're stamped, and you're pretty much told who and what you can be and what you can't do, where you can go. People forget that, you know, one time residential reserves were created through centralization. And, you know, you weren't allowed to leave those communities without that piece of paper that said you were allowed to leave. And that's within Nova Scotia. That's not, you know, overseas. That's here. So policy quite often holds us back from being innovative. And I think communities quite often always have the answers to a lot of the issues, social issues that we have, if the investment is up front and with them at the get-go, because quite often policy doesn't include those that are most affected by it.
Thank you, everyone. Aimee, did you want to share any remarks, or?
I mean, I don't think it's much different than what everyone has said. I mean, I wouldn't be inclined to prioritize one over the other. They feed one another. And I think the frameworks in which policy is developed today, they're not transparent, they're closed, and so how do you open those institutional frameworks up and allow more voices to participate in lawmaking and policy making? And, you know, as well, how, as Nigel has said, how is it that we're redefining the role of government more towards experimentation, inquiry, catalyzing the stuff that's happening on the ground? So I think it's like an opening on all sides, and it's more about how do we connect these two things versus continue down these pathways of policy making happens here and prototyping and experimentation happens here. If they're not connected, you know, they're never going to feed one another. So I think it's, I can see others want to talk, but yeah, I think really, and I mean, I will say though, I've spent most of my career trying to span these two worlds, and there's capacity building that has to happen in both, right? Like citizens, as we see in Participatory City, they need support, tools, resources, you know, to engage in policy making, you know, and just like local governments need a different kind of framing, thinking, support to actually engage with citizens and in the work of prototyping and action on the ground. So I don't want to lose that piece around capacity building that both of, or all of these parties need to engage in order to do this work differently.
If I may add something, a very quick reaction. So I think a great example is in terms of care economies is, why should we still be experimenting and debating on maternity and paternity leave? Like, you know, this is, I mean, just like do the damn policy and that's it. And then there's this experimental side of saying, okay, like how do we actually rethink the governance system, and what do we learn from mutual aid and communities on the ground, as Pamela was saying, that actually could feed back into policy. But then very quickly to something that Michael said that I think is really interesting, and we had a beautiful failed experiment in Mexico City. We're still creating policy for fixed cities, like if cities sat still, and communities and cities and society is incredibly dynamic. So how do we also think that perhaps the way that policy works, it needs to become much more dynamic in nature instead of fixed in time? And yeah, there's some experiments that we did there, but I have the feeling that this is a place of exploration as well towards the future.
All right. Well, that's an incredible amount of food for thought. And I would absolutely love it if we could take more questions. I know I have about a dozen questions I'd like to ask everyone. I'm actually craving a conference on this. I wish we had a week together, some sort of collaborative ongoing process for learning and building together regularly on reinventing democracies and economies of cities. I'm imagining this, like Nigel said, as a community of practice, a community of inquiry, a community of care. I love that framing. But we are over time. And so Tanya and I are going to close now. So we just have a few more minutes to close this. First of all, thank you to each of the speakers. Every one of you has given us so much. Thank you for your generous contributions, inviting us to think deeper, to do more than we think we can, to understand that we can only reinvent if we do it together and with love and fierce determination. I don't think anyone used the word love, but you used care, and clearly love and fierce determination is part of this. And it's also important for us to remember that our cities are mostly socially constructed, right? Everything but sacred natural laws, the air that we breathe and so on, are social constructions which we can change. And those of us alive now have an immense responsibility and opportunity to reinvent cities. So anthropologist David Graeber said, the ultimate hidden truth of the world is that it's something that we make and could just as easily make differently. So thank you for what you shared, and to all of you in the audiences, live and online, for engaging. And I know I leave with an even greater conviction that we can reconceive cities, we can build in balance with nature, the radically inclusive and vital cities that our hearts know is possible. So thanks to all of you. And for the final word, I'd like to hand it over to my friend Tanya.
Thank you so much, Jayne. Yes, and I will also extend an immense thank you, Wilalin. Muchísimas gracias, and thank you to our brilliant and inspiring speakers who have so generously and eloquently shared their wisdom, their fierce courage, expertise, depth of experience with us on the innovations, learnings, and best practices that drive their creativity, their thought leadership, and their place-based initiatives. In their unique ways, our speakers are pushing boundaries and reinventing the elements of cities that will breathe new life and possibilities into communities and civic institutions, shifting the power and tools to innovate and transform into the hands of people and communities. They are inviting all of us to bust those business as usual assumptions and paradigms and vision and prototype healthier, greener, and more equitable and humane cities and infrastructures that prioritize forms of design, technology, food sovereignty, health, and financial, regulatory, and governance systems that are all about collaboration, sustaining life, and honoring the diversity and richness of our communities and different ways of being, knowing, and doing. I feel so much more hopeful and inspired for the future, knowing that our cities are in the capable hands of our speakers. On behalf of the Art of City Building Conference organizers and partners, Jayne and myself, we also wish to express our gratitude to all of those from across the country and beyond who tuned into this very memorable session. Thank you again.
Everyone.
Okay. Thank you very much. That was amazing. Thank you very much. Really appreciate this. First of all, if you thought Zoom calls are hard, you can only imagine what these guys are going through right now. This is fantastic. Thank you so much. We're going to take a lunch break. We'll be back here at 2 o'clock. If you're watching online, we do have very limited seating available for the next 2 sessions. I think we have something like 10 left for the next session and only 3 or 4 for the final session. Do join us, and there's also a reception that you can also register for. Just go enjoy lunch. Our speakers are here. We're going to probably take them somewhere for lunch nearby. And we'll see you back here at 2 o'clock. Thank you very much. And votes. Yes, federal election, important.
Bye, everyone. Thanks.
Bye, everyone. It was wonderful.